Okay, welcome back. In this part of the RPG series of videos, we're going to start a new thing that we've not yet used in GameMaker. We're going to talk about enumerations, and we're going to use enumerations in this part of the video to allow us to show the correct version of our player sprite depending on which direction the player is moving. So let's get started. If you play the version of the starter project that we have up to this point, here we go. You can see we've got the guy who moves left and right, he moves up and down, but he doesn't correctly change direction. In the previous lesson, I went through in probably too much detail some of how all of the movement scripts are working, and I'm not going to return to talk a whole bunch more about those, but I do want to talk about one piece of all of those scripts that we just spent all that time going through, and it is this get direction facing script, which we looked at and is in our step event. If you remember, what we use this get direction facing script for is to determine which direction we're facing. And what we do is we pass in the input values coming from the human, which gives us a direction using point direction. We pass it into this function, and then we use that information to set this direction facing instance variable to either be 0, 1, 2, or 3. 0 if we're facing to the right, 1 if we're facing up, 2 if we're facing left, and 3 if we're facing down. Okay? This is important and will connect into enumerations, the thing we're just about to start. So let's go back into the beginning of our player in the create event. And here in the create event, I'm going to create an enumeration. So what in the heck does that mean? Well, enumeration, I should say, as somebody coming from theater rather than from computer science, people in computer science love to give sort of challenging sounding names to concepts that aren't really all of that challenging. And I think enumerations is one of those terms that sounds really impressive and difficult, even though the concept isn't really all that difficult. All enumeration does, or all an enumeration is, it's a way for you to provide names to constant values. There is another concept in programming called a constant, which is basically the idea of a variable that has a value that can't change. Right? A variable by its own name means you give a name to a value that can vary, that can change, you can update it later on, where a constant is just like it sounds. It is a name for a value that you cannot change. Enumeration is another way of setting up a set of constants that uses a very specific format. So, I've used the keyword enum, which is going to stand for enumeration, and I'm giving it a name. I'm going to call it dir for direction. And then I'm going to provide a list of names of directions. Right, for example, and then I'll put a comma, and then up, put a comma, and then I'll say left, put a comma, and then down, and no comma for the last one. Okay. So it's kind of like what you do when you declare a variable. You give some name, but here we're giving a name to the enumeration, which is this list, and then in the list we're giving names to each sort of position in this enumeration. The order in which I've listed these names is important because the way this works is that the first thing in the list is by default going to have a value of 0, and that value is going to stay the same In fact, I cannot change it. It's constant. And as I go down the list, similarly, each of the values I add in this enumeration is going to have incremented value starting at 0. Now you can set specific values, like I could say right equals 20 and it would be equal to 20, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to use the built-in ones. So right will be 0, up will be 1, left will be 2, down will be 3. This should sound familiar, right? If I look back in here into our, if I could find the script, into our get direction facing script, here we're getting 3 or 4 values, 0 for right, 1 for up, 2 for left, 3 for down. So this direction facing value is going to include, or it's going to store, a value that is 0, 1, 2, or 3, which is matching the way these go in here. Right is 0, up is 1, left is 2, down is 3. And we're going to make use of this enumeration with these names in order to show the player sprite that is facing the right direction, or the correct direction, I should say. So let's put in a little comment to help us out. Okay, this will be move, oops. This will be sprite directions based on direction facing. Okay. Okay, so how are we going to make use of this enumeration in order to show different sprites depending on the direction that our player is moving or facing? Well, to do that, we're going to make use of another feature of GameMaker and almost any programming language, I guess, arrays. We've not talked about arrays yet, and I'm going to give the briefest of explanations here. Basically, an array is just a collection of values. Each value is stored in a specific slot in the array. So if you think of about a variable as being a name coupled with one value, an array is a name coupled with a whole collection of values, each of which can be accessed by knowing where the value is stored in this array of values. So I've got the help system open here in GameMaker. So for example, in GameMaker, we can create a one-dimensional array, we can create a two-dimensional array. A one-dimensional array is just kind of like a list of values. Okay? So you might have an array that has, for example, here we've got 4 slots in our array, and in the first slot of the array we're storing the number 125, the second slot 4.58, the third slot a variable value, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Okay? We can also create two-dimensional arrays. A two-dimensional array, if I scroll down here, it looks like this. So it's now basically this grid, okay? And in this two-dimensional array, we have a value in the very first slot, which is slot 0, 0, and we have a value in this slot, which is 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3. We have a value in slot 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, and so on. So we can fill up a grid with a collection of values, and then later we can look for those values by using this numbering system to identify which slot in the array, in this grid, contains the value that we're looking for. And you can see that in GameMaker you can store anything inside these slots. It could be a number, it can be a string, it can be the value of some variable. Okay? It's the world's craziest and the most brief explanation, but let me show you. For example, let's say I have an array called Brian, and I want to put something into its very first slot. If it's a one-dimensional array, I can say Brian, and then these brackets, slot 0 equals, oh great, Okay, so I've stored a string in there, and then I can say Brian 1 equals crazy, like so. Okay. And what I've done is by saying Brian 0 equals great, I have, just like when we initialize and set up a variable, I'm basically creating the array and I'm storing a value into its first position. And then once I've done that, the array already exists. Now I'm storing a value into its second position, and so on. If I had a two-dimensional array, I could, and I wanted to put something in the first slot, which is in like the upper left-hand corner, I would say Brian 0, 0 equals great. Brian 0, 1 equals bald. Okay. So I've created a two-dimensional array, and I've stored a value in its first slot, I stored a value in its second slot, and so on and so forth. Okay. So here's what I want to do for our sprite that we have associated with our player. We can choose which sprite to show based on a value that is stored inside an array. Okay, so let's say we create an array called SPR. And I'm going to make that array for now to be just a one-dimensional array. And I'm going to say for the first slot, I'll call it dir right. And what does that mean? Well, dri dot right is how I can refer to this first slot in this enumeration, this first value in the enumeration. Remember, the value of that is 0. Okay? So this is another way of saying into the first slot, slot 0, in this new array that I'm going to create, I'm going to store something. And what I'm going to store is the sprite that we created. Okay, if I go back up here, take a look at my sprites, I've got one called sPlayer, I guess I should name it correctly, run right. So I'm storing a reference to this sprite inside slot 0 in this array. Okay. Let's copy and paste all that. And let's fill in the rest. So we want to do up. We want to do left. We want to do down. And for the up one, we want to say up. For the left one, confusingly, we're going to say right because we don't have a left one. We'll use the X scale to flip it around. And then we want to say down for this. Okay? All right. So that stores those values. It doesn't actually do anything yet. How do we make use of that? Well, I'm going to come into my step event, come all the way down to the very bottom, and I'm going to say sprite index equals SPR. That's the name of the array that we just created, right? And what do I want? I want direction facing, which you remember is going to either be 0, 1, 2, or 3. We'll see if this actually works. Okay, it's not happy about it because it says it doesn't know what direction facing is. It can't find that. It hasn't been set yet. So we need to double check to make sure that that value is going to be set before we try to show a sprite associated with it. Well, that's easy enough to do. Let's go back into our create event, And at the beginning of our create event, why not come way up here before we do this? Where can we put it? I guess it doesn't matter. Let's put it after the max speed. We're going to say direction facing equals, and what are we going to set it to? Well, we just set up this sprite. Let's say dir dot right. I should say we set up this enumeration. So direction facing equals dir right, which is just 0 essentially. Okay. And remember, the direction facing is going to be 0, 1, 2, or 3. So that's another way of saying it's facing to the right. Let's try that. Now we come in. Now you can see our player is now facing to the right. That's what we set it as, right? At the beginning here. We move to the right and he walks. We move up, he switches to up. We move down, he switches to down. We move left, he switches to left. Now you might wonder, there is no player run left sprite, so why is it that that's working correctly? Well, that is a leftover from the scripts that we had going here, right? Where right here, we're setting the image x scale equal to x input, and x input is either going to be -1 or 1 or 0, but we're checking to make sure it's not 0. So right here is where we're taking care of that to make sure that we are showing our player moving in the correct direction. Pretty cool, right? So by using that enumeration coupled with an array, we can allow ourselves to show the correct sprite as we're moving along.